first story that I wanted to get some of your thoughts on are about Apple and FBI. This is a little bit of a complicated story, as you know, a December 6th terror attack on a Florida Navy base. The FBI wants the data from Apple. Apple's a little bit hesitant to turn the data over. Generally speaking, where do you see tech working with government officials, working with the FBI to help, but also be worried as well about protecting people's data?
I think you framed it perfectly. There's a balance between individuals and society in terms of what technology enables, which is positive, obviously, in many different aspects of our lives, but also some of the risks. This was an issue 5 years ago, actually, with Apple also. There was a case with a problem in San Bernardino, and law enforcement wanted to open up the phone. That went back and forth. There's a new case now. This is just a trend. We'll see more of these cases in the years to come as technology, and particularly the internet, becomes so embedded in everyday life and so fundamental that it's going to deal with a lot of issues in terms of what it enables on the positive side and how do you make sure society is protected from bad things happening.
You know, some of the arguments from big tech is if we create backdoors or loopholes, it invites bad actors as well to come in. Is that a rational argument?
No, it's a fair argument. The problem with these things is they are super complicated, and you really have to dig into the details. I don't know all the details, for example, with this recent case in Florida. The law enforcement, Apple, obviously have a lot more insights than any of us would have. But these are not simple issues. It really requires engagement. That's one of the things I hope will happen more in the next 10 years, and having more engagement between the innovators, whether it be in Silicon Valley and other places, and the policymakers, because now we're going into an era where it is so fundamental. Getting the balance right here is really tricky. And of course, privacy is important. Of course, it makes sense for Apple to protect its privacy of its users. That's one of the ways they're differentiating their company versus other companies. But it's also, of course, reasonable that law enforcement has the tools to protect us as a society. So they're really tricky, and you really got to get into the details. But it's only going to happen when there is a partnership, a dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are waiting phase one, at least perhaps tomorrow, of the signing of the U.S. China trade fight, and hoping to get a little bit of a resolution. As you take a look at phase one and really going out further, and especially as a tech entrepreneur, do you feel that we got enough concessions from China, both with IP theft and some of those forced tech transfers?
Well, the tech transfer issue is probably the most fundamental and in some ways the trickiest. China actually agreed, I think it was 19 years ago, as part of a WTO agreement, to not require U.S. companies to transfer technology to be able to compete in China. But that was not really enforced. So it's partly what gets announced this week. I think having some kind of truce, having some kind of settlement here so people can move forward and there's clarity. Everybody knows the rules of the road in terms of how this is going to work. I think that's helpful, a step in the right direction. But it really comes down to the nitty-gritty and the execution of it. I think the broader issue from a strategic standpoint, even a global standpoint, is obviously for decades we've been focused on the internet as a global phenomenon, even the notion of the World Wide Web. But we are seeing, particularly in China, but also more broadly in Asia, sort of a splintering of the internet. Some even called it the splinter net. And the internet's not going to necessarily be as global and integrated as it has been for the last several decades. So there are a lot of issues around policy. I think that's going to be one of the big trends. It's not so much about what you can innovate, which has been true for many decades in the tech industry, but how that is connected into everyday life and dealing with some of the policymakers in a constructive way. Making sure both sides understand each other is going to be critical to getting these issues right.
Well, and Steve, I'm just curious, given all of your experience, how do you operate a company in China? How do you operate an internet service, given effectively you're reporting to Beijing when you do business over there?
No, it is tricky. And Google, as an example, decided not to do that. They didn't want to have to make some of the compromise necessary to be in China. But then after being out of China for many years, they decided a few years ago to go back and make some of those compromises. When I was running AOL over 20 years ago, we had a similar dilemma with some of our services. We actually decided not to continue to compete with some things like instant messaging because we were worried about some of the restrictions, including around censorship. So there's a balancing in terms of building your company, trying to build revenues, trying to serve more customers, trying to create more shareholder value, but also trying to figure out sort of your broader responsibilities in society. Every company has to make their own decision, but it's certainly getting more difficult than it was years ago.